Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and today we will be talking about my November wrap-up, so the books that I finished in November, and I already pulled up my stats on Storygraph because obviously that is what we will start with. And surprisingly, I only read 6 books. I feel like I read more, but then I just remembered that I basically had a 2-week reading slump while cleaning out my old flat, so you know, I guess that's why I didn't read as much as it felt. But anyway, as I said, I read 6 books. I read about 2,100 pages. The moods, according to Storygraph, were adventurous, mysterious, dark, emotional, and funny. In terms of pace, according to Storygraph, 60% of the books that I read were medium-paced, 20% slow-paced, and 20% fast-paced. Page number-wise, 2 books, so 33%, were under 300 pages. Then 1 book was over 500 pages, and the rest was between 300 and 500 pages, so half of those books. I only read fiction, which actually isn't true, but I think, wait a second, let me just quickly get up. I just remembered I actually didn't just read fiction this month, and I even read 7 books, but the non-fiction that I read I couldn't find on Storygraph and I was too lazy to import it, so you know, I finally read a non-fiction this year. Anyway, in terms of genres, I had 3 books that were fantasy, 2 books that were judged as romance, then classics, LGBTQIA, science fiction, and also literary books. The formats, I must have put in the wrong editions because I only have 2 books here that I read physically, but it says that I read 66% as print and 33%, so 2/3 as print and 1/3 as digital, but actually it was the other way around, I'm pretty sure. Then languages, I read most books in English, although I seem to have finished a book in German as well this month. Funny, I can't remember that. I am so confused. Maybe I did put in the non-fiction and Storygraph just didn't put it in as non-fiction, I don't know. Anyway, 2 books that I read were 3 stars. 1 was 3.75 stars, 1 was 4 star, 1 was 4.25 stars, and then 1 I didn't rate, so the non-fiction actually already was part of the 6 books, but for some reason it was like Storygraph put it as fiction. I don't know. I'm confused. Whatever. But yeah, so I had an average rating of 3.6 stars this month. And yeah, so that's it for the Storygraph stats. Now as for my inclusivity stats that I obviously also always like doing. So I only read 1 book this month by a BIPOC author. However, I would argue there's, even though it's not explicit, it's very obvious that a second book that I read this month also has a BIPOC main character. Then in terms of queerness, I had 1, 2, 3 books that had queer main characters. And in terms of disability rap, I would say there's like, I don't know, at least 1 book that had disability rap. Yeah, 1 book that had disability/mental health rep. So yeah, that's it for my stats, and now let's get into the books and start talking about them, starting obviously with the non-fiction, because I didn't rate it, and also if I read non-fiction, I do start with the non-fiction. The book that I read is actually a German publication that I do not think would have been translated into English. And it's Der Streit Pluralität, Auseinandersetzung mit Hannah Arendt by Juliane Rebentisch. It's like the fight around plurality, a confrontation with Hannah Arendt, I guess. I don't know, it's like very roughly translated the title right now. And this book is a book that I had to read for a presentation for uni, and usually I don't talk about the stuff that I read for uni because usually it's also just single texts or single chapters, but in this case I read the entire book, so I thought I would share it. This just very basically is exactly what it says in the title. It's kind of going through Hannah Arendt's work on different topics and explaining her viewpoints or interpretations of her viewpoints, and also somewhat sometimes putting her in opposition or in context with other authors that have talked about similar things as Hannah Arendt, either, you know, adding on to what Hannah Arendt said, or what's it called, like having the opposite opinion of Hannah Arendt. Like, for example, there's a whole chapter that is just about Hannah Arendt and James Baldwin, because I think Hannah Arendt once did like a reader letter to a text that James Baldwin wrote, and so it kind of talks about that and so on. It also talks about controversies around Hannah Arendt, because obviously, while Hannah Arendt says a lot of smart stuff and a lot of stuff that actually at the moment right now, especially when it comes to nation states and statelessness and all that kind of stuff, is very poignant and very fitting. She also had some not very smart viewpoints, especially when it came to Africa, for example. And so this book goes into all of that. I thought it was incredibly interesting because while I knew about Hannah Arendt already and we had to, you know, learn some of her stuff for school, and I came across her at uni and stuff, I have never really been confronted by her like full body of work as I was with this book. So I do think for that it is a good place to start. However, as a book, even as an academic book, I do not think it is that well done, because this book does not really have an intro and it does not really have an outro. Like, it doesn't have an introduction chapter and it doesn't have a conclusio resume chapter type thing, which makes it somewhat awkward to read, and there's a lot of hopping between points because it tries to kind of pull from different works of Hannah Arendt and put those in context with each other, but it doesn't always perfectly work. And so sometimes in a later chapter it feels like, well, this could have also been talked about in an earlier chapter, and actually it maybe would have been less confusing if it had already been talked about in an earlier chapter. So yeah, there's some stuff there that's very confusing, but yeah, was interesting in terms of the content matter, in terms of how it's written. I'm not sure how much I love it. So, and now that I've already bored you for 10 minutes with the nonfiction that I read this month or last month, let's get into the fiction that I read. The two books, first obviously that I rated 3 stars because I always go by the rating and stuff. First, I finally started the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells with the first novella, All Systems Red. I got this from my library because my library actually has it on Libby, and I wasn't sure if I would enjoy it enough to warrant buying the books because, you know, I've just don't have that much money. Everything gets more expensive, so I'm thinking a lot more about which books I'm buying and which books I'm not buying, which actually is really nice because I've started getting more arcs on NetGalley finally this year. So anyway, but first we have All Systems Red, and this is, as I said, the first book in the Murderbot Diaries, which follows this kind of construct, humanoid, almost robot, although I think it's just a, you know, construct in a human body, but it's weird. I don't know anymore. It's not quite a robot, is what I meant to say. That is Murderbot, and it does different things in the different novellas, and different stuff happens, and it kind of, not cancel, but my English brain isn't working right now. I'm sorry. But like it took over the control thing in its brain, and so now it can think on its own, and it started watching a bunch of serials and stuff, and yeah, it's quite interesting. So far as what I read of the first book, I don't quite get the hype behind it. I found it a bit boring, which is why I gave it 3 stars. I'm still interested enough to continue on with the series, also because most of the books are just novellas, so you know, I can read a bunch of novellas. But yeah, I might read the next book, maybe also give the 3rd book a try, and then we'll see if I'll actually finish the series. The second 3-star I read this month was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I have finally read this book. This has been on my shelves for I think almost 2 years now, 1.5 years, something like that. And this is the book where I said I would argue that this book has a BIPOC main character, because Heathcliff is so obviously, like it is so obvious that he is not white. He is constantly described as brown-skinned, as dark-skinned. He is constantly described as looking like his parents were the cheese slur, so Roma. Obviously the cheese slur is what was used in this book, because this book is almost, what, 200 years old, over 200 years, probably the beginning of the 19th century was written, right? So yeah, published 1847, so almost 200 years old. So yeah, no political correct language. What is this about? This is basically a family drama. It's about this guy who comes to this old manor house, and he kind of rents out this cottage near the manor house, and the housekeeper there tells him the story of the family that lived there, and Heathcliff is kind of the central character in all of that. And it's about, you know, how bad treatment begets horrible people, basically. I gave this 3 stars because while I enjoyed it, I just realized I need to read more classics again, because I have not unlearned, because unlearned for me is a very active vocabulary, but I have gotten out of, you know, use in reading classics. And my usual style of reading doesn't necessarily fit classics all that well, because I miss a lot of the details and a lot of the information. And so yeah, I need to start reading more classics again to get back into it, and to get used to reading classics again. So yeah, but I still enjoyed it, so I'm happy I read it. Next, I have my 3.75 stars read, and that is Traitor of Red Winter by Ed MacDonald, which is the 2nd book in the Red Winter Chronicles. I had an arc of this one. It came out, I think, around the middle of November. So this is the 2nd book in the Red Winter Chronicles, in which we follow Rain, who is a young girl who can see the dead. However, she doesn't really tell that to anyone, because people who see the dead tend to be put to death. And so she has taken refuge with a group of mercenaries, I think generally, in this cloister type thing. However, when she tries to find an escape and they are besieged, she brings another young woman to that cloister, and that starts a whole bunch of things for Rain, who then learns about stuff that she didn't previously know about, you know, as high fantasy stories start to happen. I actually enjoyed the 2nd book more than I enjoyed the 1st book. There's still the same issues that I had with the 1st book, and that, you know, there's sometimes some stuff with the lingo and with the way people talk that, for the setting and for the way the rest of the story is written, just, you know, it doesn't quite fit. It's just slightly too modern. Also, Rain is, I think, 17, and there are, like, they are not graphic, but there is multiple times where you know, Rain's sexuality is very openly talked about in terms of her masturbating and stuff, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, because obviously just because you're younger doesn't mean that you're not also sexual or sexually active. And especially in YA, I actually find it very important that we have sexual content in YA as well, not in terms of smut or, you know, written in a way where it's very voyeuristic, but, you know, just generally speaking. However, this is an adult story, and in adult stories, I don't know, there's always something weird about teenagers being very sexual in adult stories. So otherwise, I really enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the twists and turns of the story. I really, like, I personally saw the twist coming, but with a lot of twists, for me, it's also something to do with, you know, having read a lot of fantasy. So sometimes you just know, you get that feeling and you just know. I really liked the relationships. I thought, like, while it was very frustrating, the relationship developments within the story, I still thought that they were very interesting to follow. Like, Rain is a very, very self-sabotaging character when it comes to her relationship with other people, and there's a lot of that in this story, which, you know, was both nice to follow but also very frustrating. Also, Rain is bisexual, so there was a lot of that as well, and I do hope that the story is gonna end polyamorous. So yeah, but that was it for the Traitor of Red Winter. The next book I had was a 4-star read, or is my 4-star read, and that is The Witchwood Knot by Olivia Atwater, which is the first book in the Victorian fairy tales, and this one I also had as an arc. I kind of, you know, on a whim requested this arc because I hadn't read anything by Olivia Atwater before. I know that, you know, she recently had her, or in the last year, or 2022 or 2023, had her originally self-published, I think, Regency fairy tale fantasy romance books published, like traditionally published, and I think also Illumicrate did a special edition of those. I don't remember what they were called, something like the first one, yeah, Half a Soul was the first one, and it's called the Regency Fairy Tales. And I think those are fantasy romance. So I assumed originally that The Witchwood Knot would also be fantasy romance, and it is shelved by a lot of people as fantasy romance on Goodreads at least. However, I personally was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't very fantasy romancy, or not what I would consider fantasy romance. And so yeah, first let me tell you what it is about. This story follows a main character whose name I have once again already forgotten because I am terrible with names. By the way, if I forget the names or not, it has nothing to do with how good the book is. I literally forget the names of 5-star books. But so it's about this young woman who comes to this old manor house as a governess, and she is brought there to be the governess of the grandson of the lady of the house, who supposedly is gonna come to the house over summer. However, there's a lot of strange things going around the house, and this house doesn't exactly seem haunted, but, you know, out of the servants of the house, basically none of them stay there the entire night, and there's fairy stuff going on, basically, that we find out in the course of the book what exactly it is. So I really enjoyed it. You might be wondering, why did I request the book if I said surprisingly it wasn't that much romance, and that made me very happy. I'm not typically a romance person, especially when it comes to high fantasy. So I don't like fantasy romance that is set in a high fantasy setting. However, when it comes to more urban setting or historical fantasy setting, I do sometimes like a bit more romance in my books. I still haven't really found the fantasy romance subgenre where I'm like, I actually really enjoy this and I want to read more of it. But every now and again, I still like to try books that I think are fantasy romance. It's why I read the Freya Maske trilogy. I still haven't read the third book, although that one was too much romance for me and not enough of the politicking and side plot stuff. Bit along the same lines, it's why I tried A Taste of Gold and Iron by, I forgot the author's name. Once again, although there I also had an issue with the characters. Same with the Freya Maske, I just wasn't into the characters that much. I really enjoyed the main character in the Witchwood knot, which I think was part of the reason why I enjoyed it so much, maybe more so than that it wasn't actually that much romance. Like, the romance at most comes in the last third of the book. Aside from that, it's mostly our main character trying to find out what's going on and how she can keep stuff from happening. There is this tension between her and another character. In terms of the romance, I actually didn't find it that well done because I thought that the chemistry, like the subtle chemistry before it's actually fully there, wasn't quite there for me. So it felt like, you know, the full-on chemistry came kind of out of nowhere. So yeah, the romance part, I could take it or leave it, although I did quite enjoy it by the end. The thing that really made this book for me was the main character. I really enjoyed her and I do want to continue on with the series, so I'm probably gonna apply for an ARC once the next book comes out. So, and lastly, we have our 4.25 star read for this month, and that was To Shape a Dragon's Breath by Monique Blackgoose, which is the first book in the what's it called? The series. Let me just very quickly. Which is the first book in the Nampeshi Waysit series. I butchered that translation or that pronunciation even with the pronunciation guide right now. But yes. So this is an Indigenous Dragon YA book. In November it was Indigenous Heritage Month, or Indigenous History Month in the US. So I originally wanted to read 2 books by Indigenous authors, but I still haven't found the courage to pick up Warrior Girl on Earth. So I only ended up reading this one. This one is YA. It's often debated if it's YA or adult, which I'm kind of surprised about because this finally for me is a YA again with a 15-year-old main character who feels 15 years old. This character feels very teenage, very young in a lot of her actions. But anyway, what is this about? This is about Anekus, who is a young Indigenous girl in this world that is very much, you know, obviously supposed to be colonized US. So she lives on this island, and a few years ago there was this treaty, so they are allowed to kind of self-regulate. However, they are still taxed by the colonizers. And as long as they pay the taxes, they kind of are left to their own devices, but you know, that's only as long as the colonizers are happy with that. So Anekus one day discovers a dragon egg, and the dragon hatches, which means that she now has to go to a colonizer school for dragon riding to learn how to live with her dragon and to learn how to shape her dragon's breath. That's where the name comes from, because a dragon's breath is actually quite dangerous, and if a rider doesn't know how to shape the dragon's breath, then the dragon basically is put to death. That rhymed. That wasn't intentional, but anyway. And so because there's no more dragon riders among her people, she has to go to this dragon rider school because the knowledge within her people has been lost for a few generations now, as happens with colonization. And so she's confronted with the colonizers' knowledge, and also kind of finding out that the way those people do things might not work for her. I just hit the tripod, I'm sorry. And so overall, I really enjoyed the book. I had a lot of fun with it. I did give it 4.25 stars because there were some things that I thought, in terms of Anneku's characterization, don't really make sense. Like the way she treats not some people, but the way she interacts with some of the stuff that she's confronted with. For me personally, it doesn't make sense, and I'm trying to keep it vague, but overall, once again, this is a very decolonial, post-colonial book that I just very much appreciated, and I really enjoyed, and I really loved, and it is a lot about just the confrontation between two different knowledge systems and questioning what is right for yourself and what is right in total. Also, I did end up giving it 4.25 stars because I can't see this series ending well, and it just makes me depressed, but that's another thing. I will have a full review of this, however, so if you want to know my full thoughts, wait for that. I'll upload it at some point in December. And that was it for this month's reading wrap up. If you have any thoughts or comments on any of the books I shared, leave them down below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media, as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will be left linked down below, so go and check those out. And I hope I'll see you very soon. Bye!